was not that Omri didn't appreciate Patrick's birthday present to him. Far from it. He was really very grateful. Sort of. It was, without a doubt, very kind of Patrick to give Omri anything at all, let alone a second-hand plastic Indian that he himself had finished with. The trouble was, though, that Omri was getting a little fed up with small plastic figures. Of what he had loads, biscuit tinfuls, probably 3 or 4 if they were all put away at the same time, which they never were, because most of the time they were scattered about the bathroom floor, the loft, the kitchen, the breakfast room, not to mention Omri's bedroom and the garden. The compost heap was full of soldiers, which over several autumns had been raked up with the leaves by Omri's mother, who was rather careless about such things. Omri and Patrick spent many hours together playing with their joint collections of plastic toys, but now they'd had just about enough of them, at least for the moment, and that's why when Patrick brought this present to school for Omri's birthday, Omri was kind of disappointed. He tried not to show it, though, but he was. "Do you really like him?" asked Patrick as Omri stood silently with the Indian in his hand. "Yeah, he's fantastic," said Omri in only a slightly flattish voice. "I haven't got an Indian." "I know. I haven't got any cowboys either." "Nor have I. That's why I couldn't play with anything with them." Omri opened his mouth to say, "Yeah, I wouldn't be able to either," but thinking it might hurt Patrick's feelings, he said nothing, put the Indian in his pocket, and forgot all about it. After school was there was family tea. The excitement of his presents from his parents and his 2 older brothers. He got his dearest wish, a skateboard complete with a kickboard and Kryptonic wheels from his mom and his dad. And from the eldest brother, Adel, a helmet. Gillian, his other brother, hadn't bought him anything because, well, he had no money. His pocket money had been stopped some time ago in connection with a very unfortunate accident involving their father's bicycle. So when Gillian's turn came to give Omri a present, Omri was very surprised when a large parcel was put before him, untidily wrapped in brown paper and string. "What is it?" "Have a look. I found it in the alley." The alley was a narrow passage that ran along the bottom of the garden where the dustbin stood. The 3 boys used to play there sometimes and occasionally found treasures that other, perhaps richer neighbors had thrown away. So Omri was quite excited when he tore off the paper. Inside was a small white metal cupboard with a mirror in the door, the kind you see over the basin in old-fashioned bathrooms. You might suppose Omri would get another disappointment about this because the cupboard was fairly plain, and except for the shelf, completely empty. But oddly enough, he was very pleased with it. He loved cupboards, any sort of fun because they kept things in them. He was not a very tidy boy in general, but he did like arranging things in cupboards and drawers and opening them later, finding them just as he left them. "I do wish it locked," he said. "You might say thank you before you start complaining," said Gillian. "It's got a keyhole," said their mother. "And I've got a whole box full of keys." "Why don't you try them, the smaller ones, see if any of them fit?" Most of the keys were much too big, but there were half a dozen that were about the right size. All but one of these were very ordinary. The unordinary one was the most interesting key in the whole collection. Small, with a complicated lock, part of the fancy top, a narrow strip of red satin was looped through one of its curly openings. Omri saved that key for last. None of the others' keys fitted, and at last he picked up the curly top key and carefully put it in the keyhole on the cupboard door, and just below the knob. He did hope very much that it would turn, and he regretted wasting his birthday cutting wish on something so silly, or rather unlikely, that he might pass the spelling test this next day, which it would take a real magic to bring about, as he hadn't even looked at the words since they were given to him about 4 days ago. Now, we closed his eyes, unwished the test to pass, and wished instead that this little twisty key would turn Gillian's present into a secret cupboard. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door wouldn't open. Hey, Mom, I found one. Have you, darling? Which one? Her mother came over to look. Oh, that one. How very odd. That was the key to my grandmother's toolbox, and that she gave from Florence. It was made of red leather and fell to bits at last, but she kept the key and gave it to me. She was most terribly poor when she died, poor old sweetie. She kept crying because she had nothing to leave me. So in the end, I said I'd rather have this key than all the jewels in the world. And I threaded it with a bit of ribbon, it was much longer then, and hung it around my neck, and I told her I'd wear it always and remember her. And I did for a very long time, but the ribbon broke, and I nearly lost it. You could have gotten a chain for it, said Omri. She looked at him. You're right, she said. I should have done that, but now I didn't. And now it's your cupboard key, so please don't lose it, Omri, will you? Omri put the cupboard on his bedside table, opened it up, looking thoroughly through it. What would he put in it? It's supposed to be for medicine, said Gillian. You should keep your nose drops in it. No, that's just wasting it. Besides, I haven't got any other medicines. Why don't you pop this in? Mother suggested. As soon as she opened her hand, it was Patrick's Indian. Oh, I found it when I was putting your trousers in the washing machine. Omri carefully stood his Indian on the shelf. Are you going to shut the door? Asked his mother. Well, yes, and lock it. He did just this and then kissed his mother, and she turned out the light as he lay on his side, looking at the cupboard. He felt very content. Just as he was dropping off to sleep, his eyes snapped open. He had thought he heard a little noise, but no, all was quiet. His eyes closed again. In the morning, there was no doubt about it. The noise actually woke him up. He lay perfectly still in the dawn light, staring at the cupboard, from which now came the most extraordinary series of sounds. A pattering, a tapping, a scrabbling, and surely a high-pitched voice, almost like a tiny voice. To be truthful, Omri was petrified. Who wouldn't be? Undoubtedly, there was something alive in that cupboard. At last, he put down his hand to touch it. He pulled it very carefully, the door still shut tight. But as he pulled, the cupboard moved just slightly, and the noise from inside instantly stopped. He lay still for a long time, wondering, had he imagined it? That noise? Did it start? It didn't start again. And at last, he cautiously turned the key and opened the cupboard door. The Indian was gone. Omri sat up sharply in bed, peered into the dark corners. Suddenly, he saw him. But he wasn't on the shelf anymore. He was in the bottom of the cupboard, and he wasn't standing up straight. He was crouching in the darkest corner, half hidden from the front of the cupboard. And he was alive. Omri knew that immediately. To begin with, though, the Indian was trying to keep perfectly still as Omri kept lying on the bed a moment ago. He was breathing heavily. His bare bronze shoulders rose up and down as they fell, and they were shiny with sweat. The single feather sticking out of the back of his headband quivered, as if the Indian were trembling. And as Omri peered closer, and his breath fell on the tiny huddled figure, he saw it jump to its feet. Its minute hand all of a sudden made a grab for his belt and came out clutching the handle of a knife no smaller than the shaft of a tack. Neither Omri nor the Indian moved for perhaps a minute and a half. They hardly breathed either. They just stared at each other, and the Indian's eyes were black and fierce and frightened. His lips were drawn back, shining white teeth so small you could barely see them except when they caught the light. He stood pressed against the inside of the wall of the cupboard, clutching the knife, rigid with terror but defiant. The first coherent thought that came to Omri's mind as he began to get over the shock was, I must call the others. Meaning his parents and his brothers. But something, he wasn't sure what though, stopped him. Maybe he was afraid that if he took his eyes off the Indian for even a moment, he would vanish, or become plastic again, and then what would the others come running would all laugh at him and accuse Omri of making up things. And who could blame them, not believing them unless they actually saw it with their own eyes? Another reason Omri didn't want to tell anybody is if he was not dreaming and this Indian really did come to life, it was certainly the most marvelous thing that had ever happened in Omri's life, and he wanted to keep it to himself, at least at first. His first thought was that he must somehow get this Indian in his hand. He didn't want to frighten him further, but he had to touch him. He simply had to. He reached his hand slowly into the cupboard. The Indian gave a fantastic leap in the air. His black hair flew and his fringes of his leggings fluttered, and his knife raised above his head, and he flashed, and he gave a shout, which even though he was tiny, the shout to match his body was nevertheless loud enough to make Omri jump, but not so much as he jumped when the little knife pierced his finger deeply enough to draw a drop of blood. Omri stuck his finger in his mouth and sucked on it, and thought how gigantic he must look to this Indian, how fantastically brave he had been to stab him. The Indian stood there, his feet, moccasins planted apart, white painted metal floor, his chest heaving, his knife held ready, and his black eyes quite wild. Omri thought he was absolutely magnificent. "I won't hurt you," he said. "I only want to pick you up." The Indian opened his mouth, and a stream of words that were spoken in a loud, tiny voice came out, none of which Omri could understand. "Don't you speak English?" asked Omri. All the Indians in the film spoke some sort of English. It was very terrible if this Indian couldn't, because how would they ever talk to each other? The Indian lowered his knife a fraction. "I speak," he grunted. Omri breathed deeply in relief. "Oh, good. Listen, I don't know how it came to be that you came to life, but it must have something to do with the cupboard or perhaps the key. Anyway, here you are, and I think you're great. I don't mind that you stabbed me. Only, please, can I pick you up? After all, you are my Indian," he finished rather in a reasonably tone. He said this very quickly while the Indian stared at him. The knife point went down a little further, but he didn't answer. "Well, can I? Say something," urged Omri impatiently. "I speak slowly," grunted the miniature Indian at last. "Oh," Omri thought. Then he said the words very slowly. "Let me pick you up." The knife came up again in an instant, and the Indian's knees bent into a crouch. "No!" "Oh, please. You touch, I kill." The Indian growled ferociously. You might have expected Omri to laugh at this absurd threat from this tiny little creature, scarcely bigger than his middle finger, armed with only a pinpoint, but Omri didn't laugh. He didn't even look like he was laughing. This Indian, his Indian, was behaving in every way like a real live Indian brave, and despite the vast difference in their sizes and strength, Omri respected him, and even, odd it sounds, feared him a little bit. "Okay, I won't then. There's no need to get angry. I don't want to hurt you." Then the Indian looked baffled. He said, in what was supposed Indian English, "Me no hurt you." "You come near, I hurt you," said the Indian swiftly. Omri had been half laying in bed this whole time. Now, cautiously and slowly, he got up, his heart thundering. His chest couldn't be sure why he was being cautious. Was it not to frighten the Indian? Or maybe it was because he was frightened himself. He wished one of his brothers would come in, or better yet, his father, but no one came. Standing there, bare feet, took the cupboard, the top corners, turned it till it faced the window. He did it very carefully, but nevertheless the Indian was jolted. Having nothing to hold on to, he fell down, and he was on his feet again in a second, and he had not let go of his knife. "Sorry," said Omri. The Indian responded with a noise like a snarl. There was no more conversation for the next few minutes. Omri looked at the Indian in the early sunlight. He was a splendid sight. He was just under 3 inches tall. His blue-black hair had done in plait and pressed into his head by a large colored headband. He gleamed in the sun. So did the minuscule muscles of his tiny naked torso, and his skin and his arms. His legs were covered with buckskin leggings, which had some decoration on them, but too small to see properly. He wore a kind of bandolier across his chest, and a belt seemed to be made of several strands of some shiny white beads. Best of all, somehow, were his moccasins. Omri found himself wondering, not for the first time recently, where he'd put his magnifying glass. It was the only way he'd ever be able to appreciate the intricate details of the Indian's clothes. Omri looked closely as he dared at the Indian's face. He expected to see paint on it, war paint, but there was none. The turkey feather that had been stuck in his headband had now come out and fell. It was now lying on the floor of the cupboard. It was about as big as the spike of a horse chestnut, but it was a real feather. Omri asked, "Were you always this small?" "I not small, you big," the Indian shouted angrily. "No," began Omri, but then stopped. He heard his mother beginning to move about the next door, and the Indian heard it too. He froze. The door next door opened. Omri knew that any moment his mother would come in and wake him for school. In a flash, he had bent down and whispered, "Don't worry, I'll be back." And he closed and locked the cupboard door and jumped back into bed. "Come on, Omri. Time to get up." She bent down and kissed him, paying no attention to the cupboard, and went out again, leaving the door wide open.